I think George Bush was the president at the time that Hurricane Katrina happened. There were a lot of news about it at the time. I know sometimes all this thing can easily be politicized and all of that. So you mean today, how many years ago now, people are still suffering from the effect of that hurricane? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so anytime you have a disaster like that happens, if you have means and if you have resources, your recovery is going to be quicker, it's going to be more efficient. Will you be sort of dis discombobulated a little bit? Yeah, but if you have resources and access to resources, then that time is limited. For people who do not have access to resources, that time frame is extended um, far beyond those who do. So, even though a hurricane was, such a long time ago, you still have people that are still trying to rebound, and parts of the community, that still trying to rebound. And what I was going to say was, as it relates to the Mardi Gras Indian um, culture and traditions, so many of those costumes that were made and the materials that were used to make them were destroyed in the storm. And so, if you have folks that are trying to or who were heavily invested in that community before the storm, um, it, after the storm, it's like their first priority, of course, were the basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, transportation, economic um, stability, and trying to get back on their feet. The priority, even though it's critically important, may not have been to, resurrect or re engage with that cultural tradition. And so, even though the tradition is back and it's vibrant and people and communities are still engaging with it, it wasn't, or it's not to the extent that it was before the storm. If that makes sense.
Sorry that I'm going to be asking you a few things related to the hurricane. Um, yes, because this is story. This is something that have happened. We're not like trying to invent something here. Because it affects the community and it still people still continue to suffer from it several years later. It is important for me to ask you a few things, maybe personally. So, at
Okay.
the time of the hurricane, where were you? When did you first realize that something was happening?
So, believe it or not, I moved away from New Orleans in 1999. Uh, and I've been living in Atlanta. So I moved away in 99. I lived in South Africa for about a year. And when I returned from the continent, I moved to Atlanta. And so I've been here for over 20 or 22 or just about 22 years. And so when Hurricane Katrina happened, I was actually working for the American Red Cross, which part of the work that they do is disaster relief. And so, interestingly enough, I'll never forget that day, the day after the storm. Had went into work, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of people, my people from New Orleans, standing outside of the Red Cross seeking help. They had evacuated from New Orleans, and many of them did not have um, family in Atlanta, and they just needed shelter. And so, working for an organization that provides international disaster relief, like the Red Cross, it hit closer to home to me than I than I ever would have expected. Right? It was like, okay, so not only do you work for one of the world's largest disaster relief agencies, but like your family, um, extended, and people who I don't know but are just fellow New Orleanians were standing at our front door at the Red Cross seeking help. So it was doubly important for me to be present, and to do everything that I could to make sure that people got what they needed.
Mhm. All right. Did people really got what they need? What was the response? I want you to speak to me about that briefly.
So, what the Red Cross does, it's a phenomenal organization. It's typically the first agency or nonprofit organization that shows up on the scene of a disaster. And so, there are immediate needs that are addressed. So, shelter, first and foremost, clothing, um, food, and then that's what's sort of addressed immediately. And then there's an assessment of what is further needed beyond sort of the first few days after a disaster. Oftentimes it's more extended stay if individuals' homes have been severely impacted by a disaster. Sometimes it's transportation, sometimes it's food, sometimes it's a connection to governmental resources that can help with the long term recovery. And so that's sort of the type of support that the Red Cross provided. It did so after Katrina in a monumental way, but a lot of the issues that we experienced was because we didn't understand at the time just how massive the response needs were going to be. So, there were just so many lessons learned in the days following Katrina that the needs were far greater than what the organization had the capacity to address at that moment. It took a little bit of time to sort of ramp up those resources and then put in place a mechanism to distribute those resources equitably.
Thank you so much for those sharing about Hurricane Katrina and the community, the African diaspora community, in this case, the African American community in Louisiana and in other parts
Mhm.
of the US. And now let's come back to you again. How do you describe the kind of work that you do, your
Yeah.
passion and your work? Let's spend some time there.
Sure. So let me start with after I graduated from college, many of my friends, they knew exactly what they wanted to do with their lives. Many of them went on to medical school and law school and business school. Some of them went to physical therapy school, but I had no idea what I wanted. All I knew was that I had gotten this degree in African studies and I had also studied sports medicine. And so I decided to sort of merge those two topics and integrate women in development into that. And so I said, okay, I am going to write a proposal um, talking about women in development and asking someone to fund me to go and do research on South African women athletes and how they were continuing to be marginalized since the fall of apartheid. And so I sent this proposal. Actually, it was like a one-page letter to 100 companies in the U.S. Some of them were multinational, but they were all based had a presence in the U.S. And I asked them to go to fund me to go and do this really important study. And so I heard back from about four of those companies. Uh, Two of them basically said that they didn't do that type of work. One of them said that they didn't do that type of funding, but good luck. And one of them said, we don't do this type of funding, but there's a university in Atlanta that might be interested in your work. And that university was Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta. And so I sent Clark Atlanta a letter similar to the one that I sent to these 100 companies. And so Clark was like, yeah, you know what? I think that we might be interested in learning more about this. And so what they ended up doing was funding me to go to South Africa to conduct this research on South African women athletes. While I was there, I also had an opportunity to work for a small NGO called Border Institute of Primary Healthcare.